This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is part 2 of flyer number 403, entitled Masculist Public Anger. Continuing straight on. Bullet. Fluffy feminists dominate the divorce courts. In the 70s, the feminists achieved most of the legislative goals they wanted. For example, equal pay, access to the professions, fault-free divorce, the abortion right, and they took over the divorce courts, transforming them into family courts, dominated by monoconscious feminists, that is, fluffy feminists, who brought by default their fluffy expectations of men, seeing men as man-slaves who exist on this earth
to pay for women to have babies.
These fluffy feminists had their feminist consciousnesses raised. That is, they were very familiar with how men oppressed women, but were oblivious to the huge gender oppression they started committing in the divorce courts, seeing men divorcing husbands as cash machines to be abused and robbed. One father in 4 now is routinely financially crucified and has his life ruined in the hated fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court system. He will lose his custody of his kids with a 90% probability. He will lose his house to his fluffy ex-wife. He will lose half his stuff to her. He will be forced to pay for his kids, whom he will barely see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced by the hated fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges to pay her alimony for life, with no moral nor legal obligations on his fluffy parasite ex-wife to fip up and pull her own financial weight. Bullet. Fluffy feminists are truly hated by the Masculists. With one father in 4 being financially crucified in the hated fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, the Masculists claim that the casualty rate in the divorce courts for men is far greater than in a major war. This makes the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges truly hated by the Masculists, so this diabolical situation cannot continue. Men will snap, pick up arms and murder these fluffy feminist hypocrites, these destroyers of the lives of millions of men. They are truly hated by the Masculists, one of whose major aims is to mend fair the divorce courts, so that men are prepared to be fathers again, unlike today, where young men, 2/3 of them, refuse to marry, reject paternity, since they categorically refuse to play Russian roulette with their lives by marrying and having kids, when there are only 4 chambers in the barrel. That is, married fathers face a 1 chance in 4 of having their lives destroyed at the hands of the hated fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges. If a sex war comes, these fluffy feminists in the divorce courts will be murdered in their thousands. After the gender politicians who created these massively misandrous gender laws in the first place, the divorce court fluffy feminists will be the first targets of masculist soldiers' bullets. Bullet. Fluffy feminists are seen by masculists as monoconscious genociders. Masculists see the fluffy feminists in the divorce courts as indirect genociders who have to be stopped. Modern marriage is now such a shitty deal for men around the world that young men in their millions are telling each other, quote, "Don't marry, don't have kids, spend your money on yourself, go MGTOW," that's men going their own way, end quote. Currently, about 2/3 of young men reject marriage and paternity, and probably within a decade that proportion will be over 90%. Thus the MGTOW are wiping out whole populations. Monoconscious feminists, in all their gender political myopia, will accuse men of being genociders, but men, especially young men, are merely reacting to the hated toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. So the Masculists accuse the fluffy feminists of being indirect genociders, indirectly wiping out whole populations due to their fluffy feminist takeover of the divorce courts, seeing men, fluffy style, as cash machines to be robbed and abused to the advantage of women. Fluffy feminists, in their hated monoconsciousness, their ignorance of masculinist ideas, don't give a shit about the welfare of men, of the divorcing fathers, whom they routinely financially massacre and ruin their lives. This is a war issue that cannot continue. These monoconscious fluffy feminist hypocrites are indirectly wiping out whole populations, so have to be stopped, with bullets if necessary, since when the very existence of populations are severely threatened, they go to war to stop it. Masculists are increasingly talking about a sex war against these hated fluffy feminist hypocrites with their murderous callousness against men. Bullet. Women oppress men worse than vice versa. Masculists are usually bi-conscious, that is, they've had both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, so they have a basis for comparison that monoconscious feminists do not have, since by definition they know nothing about masculist ideas, so are blissfully unaware how women oppress men, and are totally unaware that in reality women oppress men far worse than vice versa, since women's oppression of men is continuous and lasts decades. For example, women's financial parasitism, brackets, by not bothering to fip up. Women's manslavery, forcing men to work for them for decades. Women's hated monoconscious hypocrisy in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts. Women's many decades-lasting gender crimes against men, for example, paternity fraud, where in about 5% of pregnancies the husband is not the father. Women's pill lying, where the wife/girlfriend lies to her husband/boyfriend that she's taking the pill, but in reality isn't, gets pregnant, then forces millions of men to pay for a kid he doesn't want, thus manslaving him for years. Women's tooth and nail opposition to the legislation of the para, that's paternity rejection right, that would allow a man to reject an unwanted pregnancy the way a woman can with the mara. So that if the woman goes ahead with the pregnancy, instead of aborting, then legally she has full financial responsibility for the costs of the kid, etc. When one compares the gender oppression of women by men with the gender oppression of men by women, the latter is obviously far worse. But since most women know nothing about masculinist ideas, they continue to suffer the delusion that gender oppression is a one-way street taught to them by monoconscious feminism. Bullet. Masculinist anger at women's monoconsciousness has reached explosion point. You can hear the anger and hatred in my words above. I am obviously a very angry, hateful masculist. I am far from being the only one. Millions of men are now waking up thanks to MGTOW and Masculist videos on the internet that are reaching hundreds of millions of men across the world. Masculist ideas have now pretty much crystallized and taken solid form, so that the next stage is now ready to be launched, and that is to change the gender laws and to remodel society so that the awful discrimination against men is removed. The lack of this removal is what is causing men to reach explosion point, which is now probably only a few years away, as the number of very angry and hateful men increases, to the point that a major tipping point is reached when a masculinist explosion occurs that then spreads across the planet at the speed of light, thanks to the internet. Bullet. Masculinists will soon explode and radically change society. Just as the feminists did in the 70s, Masculists will soon force their demands on society, causing major shifts in gender political attitudes and the men-fairing of the gender laws. Masculists will push for the men-fairing of the divorce courts, the legislation of the para, and will remove legal and social discrimination against men across the board. Bullet. The Masculists will create a FIP society. One of the major political social goals of the Masculists is the creation of a FIP society, that's with a capital F, capital S, in which both sexes, especially girls, are socialised by parents and educated by teachers and professors to be FIPs, expecting in moral terms not to parasite off the money and labour of a man, to bother to get a career-competent education, so that she pulls her financial weight as an adult, accepting equal rights with men and equal obligations with men, that is, sharing out the burden of earning the living equally with men. Otherwise she can expect to be pariahed by men and by society. A fluffy woman in the near future will be severely punished by men who will refuse to have anything to do with her, seeing her as a fluffy manslaver, as vermin, to be wiped out, not even pumped and dumped. Masculists talk a lot about the creation of a FIP society, since such a creation will go a long way to solving most of men's gender political problems, especially in the divorce courts, which need to be deeply reformed so that custody of kids is given jointly by default to both parents. No splitting of assets, no alimony, no loss of the father's house, etc. Women will be expected to be FIPs and are punished by society if they have not made the effort to FIP up. Fluffies will be increasingly spat at in the coming years as vile, as parasitic, as manslavers, to be hated and rejected. The legislation of the para, the absence of which in today's world is the greatest of sexual discriminations that exists, is another major masculinist political goal. Implementing the para becomes much more practical in a FIP society, since divorcing mothers will be able to afford to pay for half of the kids' upkeep, and will be expected to. A FIP society will generate much healthier relations between the sexes, as both sexes are socialised to be responsible adults, not expecting to parasite child-mindedly off the labour and money of a man. The rise of masculism, the creation of a FIP society, will force women to grow up, to FIP up, to take responsibility for their own lives, and if they don't, they will be severely punished by not getting a man, and will be spat at by both sexes. This is the end of part 2.